Hi, I'm Lauren. 2 weeks after my husband Andrew died of a sudden heart attack, my parents came to visit, not to comfort me, not to ask how their granddaughter was coping, but to ask for money. Not supported, not helpful. A demand for half of Andrew's life insurance, because in their words, you'll still have plenty left. And when I said no, they didn't cry. They didn't even look sad. They threatened to take me to court. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I just opened the door and asked them to leave before my daughter came home and saw what entitlement looks like wrapped in the language of family. That moment changed everything. Because grief didn't just show me who I'd lost. It revealed who had never truly been there. Let me know in the comments. What time are you watching this? And where from? And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe so these stories keep reaching the people who need them most. I met Andrew Bennett during my sophomore year at the University of Virginia. At the time, I was barely staying afloat in my intermediate economics class, drowning in supply curves, depreciation schedules, and the kind of textbook jargon that made my head throb. Andrew was the TA assigned to our section. He wasn't like the others, where most offered rushed explanations before hurrying off to their next commitment. Andrew stayed behind. He sat beside me one afternoon after class, slowly walking me through a problem set I'd fumbled. His voice was calm, steady, patient. That was the first thing I fell for: his patience. And then his laugh. He had one of those full-body laughs, the kind that starts deep in the chest and spills out like sunlight. His smile creased the corners of his eyes, and I remember thinking, I want to be the reason he smiles like that. We started dating not long after that. Study sessions turned into coffee runs. Coffee runs turned into long walks around Charlottesville. By the time graduation approached, we were inseparable. On the day we walked across the stage, Andrew handed me my diploma with a grin. Inside the case, tucked behind the paper, was a ring. We married young, 23, and impossibly optimistic. Everyone told us to wait. Live a little, they said. Travel, build your careers first. But Andrew was what I wanted to experience. I didn't need a year in Paris or a solo hike through the Rockies. I wanted Sunday mornings in bed with him, messy grocery lists, and the quiet, everyday magic of building something together. After earning his MBA, Andrew landed a job at a top financial advisory firm in downtown Denver. He climbed the ranks quickly, not because he played politics, but because people trusted him. He had a way of making others feel seen, listened to. He wasn't just a numbers guy, he was a people guy too. That rare mix made him not just successful, but exceptional. For the first 5 years of our marriage, it was just the two of us. We traveled when we could. We hosted small dinners with friends. We binge-watched shows and argued over which pasta shape was superior. We were building a life that felt honest and whole. When we finally decided to try for a baby, we assumed it would be simple. But life, in its brutal unpredictability, had other plans. What followed were 3 years of heartbreak, 2 miscarriages, endless doctor visits, and one grueling round of IVF that nearly broke us emotionally and financially. We were just beginning to explore adoption when something unexpected happened. I was pregnant. And that's where our story shifted again, though not in the way I ever could have imagined. Pregnancy wasn't easy for me. Carrying Sophie felt like holding my breath for 9 months straight. The doctors placed me on bed rest for the final 2 months due to complications. Andrew adjusted his schedule, working remotely from our small home office. Every morning he'd bring me breakfast in bed, eggs just the way I liked them, toast, cut diagonally, and a tiny post-it note with a silly doodle or a motivational quote that always made me smile. He massaged my swollen feet each night, read baby books aloud to my belly, and told Sophie stories about her future, the places we'd go, the pancakes they'd make together, the soccer games they'd win. When Sophie was born, Andrew cried harder than I did. He held her like she was made of light, eyes red with joy, his hand never leaving the back of her tiny head. That day, I remember thinking, this is the family I always dreamed of. And somehow I got it. The years that followed were filled with a quiet kind of magic, Andrew learned everything he could about parenting. He volunteered to coach Sophie's soccer team, even though he had never played a game in his life. I'd find him on the couch late at night, watching YouTube tutorials on passing drills and goalie techniques, muttering about offside rules like a true student of the game. His calendar was a mosaic of color-coded reminders, school pickups, pediatrician visits, science fair deadlines, soccer practices. He never missed a single event. And when Sophie had nightmares, it was Andrew who sat by her bedside stroking her hair and whispering lullabies he made up on the spot. But there were signs, little things that we both brushed off, because love has a way of making you ignore discomfort, especially when you're happy. Andrew occasionally mentioned chest tightness, blamed it on stress. He got winded after a single flight of stairs but chalked it up to being out of shape. His blood pressure had been slightly elevated during a checkup. Nothing alarming, the doctor said. Just take some aspirin, eat less sodium, exercise more. He promised he would. And I believed him. The morning it happened was a Tuesday. Sophie had an art show at school that night, and Andrew had promised he'd come home early to help her set up. That morning he made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, her favorite, and joked that his velociraptor looked more like a burnt waffle. He kissed us both goodbye, and with one hand on the doorknob called out, "Don't forget the maple syrup, real stuff, not the corn syrup garbage." I rolled my eyes and smiled. It was the last sentence he ever said to me. At 10:47 a.m., my phone rang. It was Tessa, his assistant. Her voice was shaking. "Lauren, it's Andrew. He collapsed in a meeting. The paramedics are here. They're taking him to Cedars-Sinai. I don't remember grabbing my keys. I don't remember the drive. Just sirens in my head louder than anything on the road. I was whispering prayers I didn't even realize I remembered, bargaining with a God I wasn't sure still listened. If I get there in time, if I can hold his hand, if he just wakes up." But I was too late. Andrew was pronounced dead at 11:23 a.m. They said it was a massive heart attack. They said it was instant. They said there was nothing anyone could have done. As if those words would dull the sound of my world breaking. When I saw him, he still looked like himself. His lips still held a trace of color, his hair still messy from that morning. His skin was warm, but his chest didn't rise. That stillness absolute was what undid me. I held his hand and waited for him to open his eyes, to say something, anything. But silence filled the room like cement. And in that silence, I realized something I never thought I'd have to consider. I was now the only parent Sophie had. The hours after that were a blur. Paperwork, hospital forms. The word widow was whispered like I might shatter under it. Friends calling. Colleagues are texting condolences. The funeral home asked me whether I preferred cremation or burial and whether he had a favorite suit. And all I could think was he liked that blue one, the one Sophie called his super daddy suit. But none of those decisions felt real. None of them made sense. What made sense was the way he kissed Sophie's forehead every night. What made sense was the smell of pancakes and maple syrup. What made sense was him. And now he was gone. What haunted me more than the silence, more than the absence, was the realization of what still lay ahead, telling Sophie her father wasn't coming home. How do you explain death to an 8-year-old? How do you tell her that the man who made dinosaur pancakes that morning is never walking through that door again? The hardest thing I've ever done wasn't burying Andrew. It was pulling the car over to the side of the road, turning to face my daughter in the back seat, and saying the words that would fracture her childhood forever. She had just climbed into the car after school, excited, holding her handmade flyer for the art show that night. "Where's Daddy?" she asked, scanning the front seat. "He said he'd pick me up today." I couldn't speak. My throat tightened like it was closing in on itself. I pulled the car over, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and stared ahead for a moment, trying to remember how to breathe. Then I turned to her. She looked so small, 8 years old, with wide eyes, and Andrew's dimpled chin, still believing in magic and promises. "Sweetheart," I began, my voice shaking. "Something very sad happened today. Daddy got really sick at work, and his heart stopped working. Her brow furrowed. But the doctors can fix it, right? I've never hated reality more than in that moment. No, baby. When someone's heart stops working completely, the doctors can't fix it. She stared at me silent, then whispered, "So Daddy's not coming home. Ever?" I nodded, my face soaked with tears. The sound that came out of her wasn't a sob, it was a howl. Raw, animal, unfiltered grief. She threw herself into my arms, screaming, "I want Daddy! I want my Daddy!" I held her there on the side of the road as life carried on around us. Cars passing, birds chirping, the world completely indifferent to the wreckage inside my car. It felt like time had split in two, the world before 11:23 a.m., and the world after. That evening, I tucked Sophie into our bed now, and gave her one of Andrew's t-shirts to sleep in. She clutched it like a lifeline. I sat in the bathroom with the door closed, muffling my cries into a towel. The grief came in waves so violent I thought I might drown in it. And when I couldn't take the silence anymore, I called my parents. They had been married for 40 years. They had buried friends, survived job losses, health scares, and family ruptures. I thought maybe they'll know what to say. Maybe they'll show up. My mom answered on the fifth ring. I could hear music and clinking glasses in the background. "Lauren, can I call you back? We're at Madison's birthday dinner, her big 4-0. We've got everyone here." "Mom." I choked, my voice barely audible. "Andrew died this morning. He had a heart attack." A pause. Then a muffled voice came as she covered the receiver. "Richard, it's Lauren. She says Andrew died." When she came back on the line, her tone had shifted, but only slightly. "Oh my goodness, that's terrible. Are you sure?" "Maybe there's been some mistake. I saw his body," I whispered. "There's no mistake." Another pause. Then, "Well, this is a shock. But sweetheart, we've got the caterers here. It's Madison's big night. Can you manage tonight? We'll stop by tomorrow once things settle down." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. Minutes later, my father called. I didn't want to answer, but I did. Maybe he'd be different. "Lauren," he said, his voice calm, businesslike. "This is devastating. Was Andrew's life insurance in order?" "You should call the company first thing tomorrow." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "We're coming now." Just call the insurance company. I stared at the wall as he spoke, numb. It was like hearing a stranger talk about someone else's tragedy. "I can't believe this is your response," I said quietly. "Sophie lost her father. I lost my husband. And you're at a birthday party, asking about money." My father sighed, that same condescending sigh he'd used throughout my childhood. "Lauren, be reasonable. Madison's birthday has been planned for months. The family flew in. We can't just walk out." "Forget I called," I said, and hung up. I sat there listening to the silence. Then something occurred to me, an echo of what I'd just said. Forget I called. That's when I realized I had been calling them my whole life, begging for attention, for equal love, for presence. And this was their answer. When my world cracked open, they chose shrimp cocktail and small talk over their daughter's grief. It wasn't just absence, it was abandonment. And I knew deep down something had shifted. Not just my marriage, not just my future, but my family. The morning of Andrew's funeral was disarmingly beautiful. The kind of early spring morning that carries the scent of new blossoms and soft light that makes everything look forgiving. But nothing about that day felt forgiving to me. Grief sat heavy in my chest, and every movement felt like wading through thick water. Sophie woke early, unusually quiet. She stood by her closet, holding up a blue dress. "Daddy said I looked like a princess when I wore this," she whispered. Her voice cracked around the word daddy. I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "He'd be so proud of how brave you are today." I helped her with her hair, twisting a small braid across her temple, the way Andrew used to do before soccer games or school performances. the little rituals we carry forward when the people who taught them are gone. We arrived at the funeral home an hour early. I needed time to breathe, to prepare to not fall apart in front of everyone. Sophie clutched my hand tightly, her small fingers trembling. My job now was to hold both of us together. Andrew's colleagues began arriving first, dressed in dark suits, eyes red and swollen. These were not just clients or co-workers. They were people who'd known the kindness of his humor, the steadiness of his presence. Each one knelt to Sophie's level, sharing stories I'd never heard: how he stayed late to help a junior analyst through a divorce, how he once lent money quietly to a colleague in crisis. They weren't just there to mourn a colleague, they were grieving a friend. Ethan, Andrew's brother, flew in from Japan just hours before the service. He looked drained, jet-lagged, pale, heartbroken. When he saw Sophie, he didn't speak. He simply knelt, took her hands, and pulled her into a long, silent hug. That moment did more to steady me than anything else that day. My parents, however, texted me 20 minutes before the ceremony began. Stuck in traffic. Don't start without us. Madison's dress zipper broke trying to fix it. Be there soon. They arrived just as people were taking their seats. My mother's perfume was strong, her heels loud on the funeral home floor. She hugged me quickly and whispered, "We made it." The traffic was a nightmare, and Maddie had the hardest time finding something respectful to wear last minute. Last minute. As if Andrew's death were an impromptu dinner party. During the service, I could feel my parents behind me, my mother dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue she barely used, my father checking his watch. Madison scrolled through her phone, her screen lighting up like a beacon of disinterest. Meanwhile, Ethan sat quietly beside Sophie, holding her hand the entire time, their matching blue eyes clouded with tears. When it came time for the eulogy, my legs felt like anchors. I walked to the podium on willpower alone. But when I saw Sophie, so small, so dignified in her blue dress, I found the strength to speak. I told the story of Andrew's dinosaur pancakes, his endless optimism, his inability to tell a joke without laughing halfway through. I talked about the way he loved Sophie fiercely and completely, about the time he cried watching her perform a two-line part in the school play, about his annoying insistence that real maple syrup was one of life's non-negotiables. When I said, "He always put family first," my voice caught. Because as I looked down, I saw the people who'd shown up for us, Ethan, the Bennetts, our neighbors, our friends, and then I saw my parents already gathering their things as if eager to beat traffic home. After the burial, we hosted a small reception at our house. Friends brought casseroles and offered awkward but heartfelt condolences. Andrew's co-workers helped set up chairs, refilled drinks, and held Sophie when she started crying. It was messy and real and full of love. My parents and Madison mostly sat in the living room drinking wine and chatting with extended family as if they were the grieving center. My father lingered near the drinks table, talking in hushed tones with my Uncle Martin, loud enough that I still heard. He was on the partner track, you know. That life insurance has to be significant. Lauren's set for life now. The words hit like ice water. Andrew hadn't even been buried for 8 hours, and they were already calculating what he was worth. I wanted to scream, to throw them out, but I was too tired, too busy watching Sophie as she tried to be gracious to strangers who whispered about how sorry they were, too focused on making sure she ate, on protecting what remained of our day. Diane and Richard, my own parents, left shortly after sunset. They offered short, obligatory hugs. No offer to help clean up. No gesture of support for the night that lay ahead, the first night after burying the man who was everything to us. But Ethan stayed. So did Andrew's parents. Diana took over bedtime, reading Sophie a story. Robert helped wash the dishes, then quietly took out the trash without being asked. As the last light faded from the sky, I realized something. The people I expected to show up didn't. And the people who chose to show up stayed. 2 weeks after the funeral, I was sitting at the kitchen table trying to make sense of our health insurance paperwork. The house was quiet. Sophie had just returned to school for the first time since losing Andrew, and the silence felt unfamiliar, almost hostile. It was the kind of quiet that lets grief slip into every room, every drawer, every thought. I was staring blankly at a form I'd read 3 times when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw my parents on the porch. Richard was adjusting his golf shirt like he was about to step into a meeting. Diane stood beside him, checking her lipstick in a compact mirror. Neither of them had warned me they were coming. I opened the door slowly, unsure of what to expect. "I didn't know you were stopping by," I said. "We thought we'd check in," my mother replied, breezing past me into the house. "See how you and Sophie are holding up." "She's at school," I said, still standing near the doorway, unsure whether to shut the door behind them or leave it open as an exit. "Good," my father added as he stepped into the living room. "That'll make this conversation easier." That should have been my warning. I walked into the kitchen, instinctively slipping into host mode, offering coffee without knowing why. Maybe I hoped that if I treated them like guests, they'd behave like family. When I returned with 2 mugs, I found my father admiring the new sound system Andrew had installed just a month before he died. "Nice setup," he said, running his hand along the sleek black speakers. Andrew had good taste in electronics. "He did," I said quietly. Every use of the past tense still felt like a betrayal. They made small talk for a few minutes about Sophie's school, about the garden club Diane had rejoined. But then, like a clock winding down to a dreaded chime, my father cleared his throat in that practiced way he always did before delivering important news. "Lauren." He began, setting his mug down on a coaster with deliberate care. "We wanted to talk to you about your situation." I raised an eyebrow. "My situation? Your financial situation," Diane clarified, exchanging a loaded glance with Richard. Now that things have changed, I didn't respond right away. I just stared at them, waiting. "We're getting older," my father continued. "Our retirement took a hit after the last market downturn, and healthcare costs aren't getting any cheaper. Your mother's been worried about it." "We both have." I felt my chest tighten. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said cautiously. "Well," he said, shifting forward in his seat, "given Andrew's position at the firm and the life insurance policy, we thought you might be in a position to help the family. After all, we're your parents, and family takes care of family." There it was, not even subtle. "You're asking me for money," I said flatly. "Not just money," my mother added quickly, as if that softened it. "Support. You're in a better place now. You and Sophie will be fine. But your father and I—" How much, I interrupted. "How much were you thinking?" My father brightened, clearly mistaking my question as cooperation. "Well, we thought something substantial would be appropriate. Perhaps half of the life insurance payout. That would secure our retirement and leave plenty for you and Sophie." Half. 50% of the money Andrew had left was to protect Sophie's future. 50% of the security he had painstakingly built for the family he loved. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. "You want me," I said slowly, "to give you half of the money meant to take care of your granddaughter after her father died." "We're not asking for all of it," my father replied, as if that were generous. "And Andrew, well, he should have taken better care of himself. He knew he had a heart issue." I went completely still. "He was worth 100 of you," I said, my voice trembling but clear. "And you couldn't even be bothered to leave a party the day he died. Now you sit here in his house asking for what he left behind as if it's your due." "Lauren, don't be emotional," my mother said, her voice suddenly sharp. "We raised you. We paid for your college. We helped with the down payment on your first house. Don't act like you owe us nothing." My grief twisted into something sharper, something colder. "No," I said, rising from my chair. "What I owe you is exactly this moment. The moment I finally say, 'Get out of my house.'" "Lauren, be reasonable," my father said, standing now, his voice hardening. "We're your family. Respect is earned," I said. "And you've earned none. Not when I needed you. Not now." and never if this is who you choose to be. They looked stunned, genuinely surprised that I would speak to them like this, as if their parental title shielded them from consequence. I walked to the door and held it open. Leave. Before Sophie comes home and sees who her grandparents really are. They left in a huff. Diane muttered something about me being ungrateful. Richard didn't say goodbye. As the door closed behind them, I sank to the floor, trembling not from weakness, but from the overwhelming release of holding my boundaries, maybe for the first time in my life. That day I lost what was left of the illusion that they would ever be the family I needed. But I also found something else. A boundary. A line drawn with pain, but also with clarity. And I wasn't going to let them cross it again. For days after I kicked my parents out, the house felt heavier. Not because they were gone, but because something inside me had finally broken open. There's a specific kind of grief reserved for when you realize your parents are not the people you hoped they were. And it's different from losing a spouse. It isn't sharp like death. It's dull quiet, like betrayal humming under your skin. I didn't hear from them again until the following week. They texted, called, left voicemails. Some were accusatory, others sounded rehearsed. We only want to help. Let's discuss this like adults. There was even a message from Madison, my sister, who had barely made eye contact with me at Andrew's funeral. You've always been selfish, but this is low even for you. Mom and Dad deserve better. It would have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. That Friday evening, while Sophie and I were eating dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, one of Andrew's comfort meals, my phone buzzed again. A voicemail. My father. We're calling a family meeting. Sunday at 2. Our house. Bring Sophie. Bring Sophie. The arrogance of it hit me like ice. After everything they'd said, everything they hadn't done, they thought they could just summon us. I set the phone down, my appetite gone. Across the table, Sophie was quiet. She was getting better at reading the energy in the room. Was that Grandpa? She asked, softly pushing a corner of grilled cheese around her plate. I nodded. He wants us to come to their house on Sunday. Do we have to? She asked, her voice barely audible. That question hurt more than the voicemail. Once upon a time, Sophie had adored her grandparents. But even at 8, she understood something had shifted. I sighed. I think we should go. Not because we owe them anything, but because sometimes when people hurt you, it's okay to face them, to say your truth out loud. She nodded after a moment, then added quietly, Can I bring something with me? I have an idea. What kind of idea? I asked, surprised by her sudden intensity. It's something Daddy taught me, she said, about standing up for yourself. Later that evening, I saw her working at her little desk in her bedroom. Crayons, paper, markers. She refused to let me peek. It's a surprise, she said. For Grandpa and Grandma. I didn't press. Sunday came quickly. As we pulled into my parents' driveway, the same house I grew up in, I saw familiar cars lining the curb. They hadn't just invited us. They'd invited an audience. Aunts, uncles, even Madison. They thought numbers would intimidate me, or maybe guilt me into agreement. But they didn't understand something fundamental. I wasn't the same daughter who used to swallow my voice just to keep the peace. As we walked to the front door, I looked down at Sophie. She was clutching a manila envelope to her chest, her lips pressed together with determination. Are you sure? I asked gently. She nodded. I'm ready. My mother opened the door before I could knock, dressed like she was heading to Sunday brunch. She smiled too widely. Lauren, Sophie, come in. Everyone's waiting. The living room was arranged like a boardroom. My father sat in his favorite recliner, back straight. Madison perched on the arm of the couch, scrolling through her phone. My Uncle Martin and his wife were on the love seat. Every seat felt carefully selected, like we were guests being judged, not family being embraced. We appreciate you coming, my father began. There are things we need to discuss as a family. I remained standing, Sophie at my side. Then whatever you need to say it in front of my daughter. Because it affects her future. My mother frowned. Lauren, this isn't really a conversation for a child. I didn't flinch. If it's not appropriate for her to hear, then it's not appropriate for you to ask. A few people shifted uncomfortably. But my father plowed forward. He laid out what he called a fair proposal: 50% of Andrew's life insurance for him and my mother. Another 15% for Madison, who was still struggling to find her place in life. He handed me a printed breakdown with actual dollar figures. They had done the math. You want 65% of the money my husband left behind for his daughter? I said, my voice calm. Money he earned, that he planned, that he specified. You're being emotional, Madison said, finally looking up. This is about fairness. At that, Sophie stepped forward. I have something to say, she announced. The room fell silent. My mother forced a smile. Sweetheart, maybe the grown-ups should… No, Sophie interrupted. This is about Daddy, and he wouldn't be okay with this. She opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a drawing. It looked like an invoice. At the top, in her careful handwriting, it read, Bill for real love and support. Underneath were lines like, being there when Daddy died, $0 not provided. Helping Mommy when she was sad, $0 not provided. Hugging me when I cried, $0 not provided. Being real grandparents, priceless but not earned. At the bottom, total due $0. She handed it to my father and looked him in the eye. You came here for money. This is what you earned. No one said a word. Even Madison stopped scrolling. My father's hands shook as he held the paper. My mother began to cry, but I couldn't tell if it was shame or strategy. Sophie returned to my side and took my hand. I looked around the room and said clearly and calmly, Don't contact us again, unless it's to apologize and truly change. Sophie deserves better grandparents, and I deserve better parents. Then we walked out. The door didn't slam, but the line we crossed that day, it was final. The silence in the car on the way home wasn't heavy. It was cleansing. Sophie sat in the back seat, still clutching her now empty manila envelope like it held armor. Her small shoulders were relaxed, her expression unreadable but calm. I stole a glance at her through the rearview mirror and felt something unexpected: pride. Not just in her courage, but in how clearly she knew the difference between love and manipulation. When we got home, Sophie went to her room without needing to be asked. She had earned her peace. I stayed downstairs, still dressed in the same clothes I'd worn to that orchestrated ambush, feeling hollow and wired at the same time. That's when I remembered something Andrew had once said. It was during a late-night conversation months before Sophie was born, after one of his routine checkups. If anything ever happens to me, he'd said, Don't worry. Everything will be okay. I've made sure of it. At the time, I'd laughed and told him to stop being dramatic. Now I wasn't so sure. I went into the home office. We had once shared the space where Andrew kept every important document labeled and cross-referenced with his usual precision. His filing cabinet was untouched since the day he died. I opened the top drawer, found the estate planning folder, and leafed through it slowly. Legal forms, insurance copies, notarized wills, everything in perfect order. And then at the very back, I found a sealed envelope with my name on it in Andrew's handwriting. My heart stopped for a moment. It wasn't thick, just one folded letter inside, dated 3 months before his death. I sat down, hands shaking, and opened it. My dearest Lauren, if you're reading this, it means the doctor's concerns about my heart were more serious than I let on. I'm sorry. I didn't want you to worry. I thought I could beat it. I thought I had more time. I've updated everything: our will, the insurance, Sophie's education fund. You're protected. She's protected. That was all that ever mattered. There's something else I need to tell you. I wasn't going to, but if I'm not around, you need to know. Your father approached me twice in the last year. Once casually, once more directly. He said he was looking for investment opportunities, but it was a thin veil. He wanted money. I didn't tell you because I knew how much you wanted to believe in them. I didn't want to damage that hope if it could still be true. But please, Lauren, don't let them manipulate you. That money is for you and Sophie, for her college, for her future. Your parents have made poor financial decisions for years. I understand hardship. But this isn't about hardship. It's about entitlement. And Sophie's future is not for sale. If they come asking again, you already have your answer. This letter is your permission to say no, and your reminder that you never needed permission to begin with. Live fully. Love deeply. Be fierce in protecting what matters. I trusted you with both our hearts. Always, Andrew. I don't know how long I sat there. The grief was familiar by then, but this was different. It wasn't just sadness. It was vindication. It was fury and relief and a quiet, aching love. He had known, not just about his heart, not just about the legalities, but about them. About how easily they could twist a moment of vulnerability into a demand. And he had tried to shield me from it not just in life, but in death too. And suddenly, everything was clear. The way my father had slid so easily into financial discussions after Andrew's death. The way my mother had justified their party over my pain. The way they had walked into my home not with comfort but with calculation. They had always planned to take. Andrew had planned to protect. I picked up the phone and called Daniel Price, the attorney who had helped Andrew with our estate planning. I told him everything, the confrontation, the letter, my parents' request. He listened quietly, then said, Lauren, everything Andrew set up is airtight. You and Sophie are the sole beneficiaries. They have no legal standing. Can they contest it? They can try, but they'll lose. That should have comforted me, and in some ways it did. But more than anything, I felt something deeper rage, not just for me, but for Andrew. He had died trying to give us peace, and now the people who should have been our comfort were turning his love into leverage. Not on my watch. I thanked Daniel and hung up. Then I walked into Sophie's room. She was drawing something new. A bird is flying above a house. Free. Hey, I said softly. Daddy wrote us a letter. She looked up, her eyes wide. Can I read it? Not yet, I said, hugging her close. But I promise it says everything we already knew. Because somehow, even in death, Andrew had spoken the words I hadn't yet been able to say out loud. No, you don't get to take what he left us. You never did. In the weeks that followed, I stopped expecting apologies. Something inside me had shifted after reading Andrew's letter. It was like he'd handed me a lantern in a dark cave I'd been stumbling through for years. Suddenly, every memory glowed with painful clarity. Every time I swallowed my hurt, every time I'd made excuses for my parents' absence or rationalized away the favoritism. It wasn't just about the funeral or the money. It was about a pattern so old I had stopped seeing it. The childhood piano recital they left early from because Madison had a softball game. The way they'd praised her C-plus art project like it was genius while brushing off my science fair trophy with a nod. The Christmas I got winter coats and socks while she got a new iPad because she's sensitive and creative. All of it had been a slow erosion so subtle that I'd learned to call it normal. But grief strips away illusions. And Andrew, even in death, had handed me the courage to finally call things what they were. One night while Sophie was asleep, I called Amanda, Andrew's old assistant. She had become something of a friend since the funeral, checking in, occasionally offering help I hadn't known how to ask for. I need to ask you something, I said after explaining everything. Am I overreacting? Is this just grief making me see everything through a distorted lens? There was a long pause, then her voice steady and kind. Lauren, if my parents had done what yours just did, I wouldn't be questioning whether I was overreacting. I'd be changing the locks. Her words grounded me, gave me permission to trust myself. I called Ethan next. He had returned to Japan after the funeral but promised to come back for a few months in the summer to help us adjust. I told him about the confrontation, the letter, the invoice Sophie had made, and my parents' ongoing campaign of guilt. They asked for half of Andrew's life insurance, I said, still stunned by the audacity of it even weeks later. They what? Ethan exploded. Are you kidding me? I wish I was. He paused, then said something I'll never forget. Andrew told me once years ago that if anything ever happened to him, his biggest fear wasn't about Sophie's future or your finances. It was that you'd still be trying to earn the love of people who never really gave it freely. My throat tightened. So what do I do? You protect Sophie. You protect Andrew's legacy. And you stop looking backward. That's how you honor him. Those words anchored me in a way that no legal document could. From that point on, I made a choice not just to grieve Andrew, but to protect what he died building. The life we had. The values he lived by. The love he poured into both of us. I also made another choice, one that felt both liberating and deeply painful. I stopped calling my parents. I didn't block them, not yet. But I ignored their texts, their emails, their voice messages that ping-ponged between shame and scolding. Instead, I put my energy where it belonged. Ethan helped me sort through Andrew's belongings when he returned. Diana and Robert Andrews' parents began calling every few days, checking in on Sophie, sending her books and baking kits, filling her life with soft reminders of who her father was. Nancy, our neighbor, offered to walk Sophie to school when I was too emotionally drained to leave the house. Kevin's old co-workers invited us to a company picnic and surprised Sophie with a memory book they'd made about her dad. Love, I realized, had never been absent. It just hadn't always come from the places I was taught to expect it. Meanwhile, Sophie was growing gently but fiercely. She had nightmares, yes. But she also had days filled with laughter and new resilience. She'd taken to sleeping with Andrew's old flannel shirt and carrying her drawing notebook everywhere. One evening, she handed me a page. It was a sketch of a family tree. But instead of names, each branch had a word: kindness, honesty, safety, love. At the bottom, she had written in bold block letters, "Real family." I stared at it for a long time, realizing that somewhere along the way, she had started defining family, not by blood, but by presence, by who showed up, by who stayed, by who held space when the world fell apart. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel broken. I felt chosen. It had been 2 weeks since the confrontation at my parents' house. Sophie had returned to her routine school reading time, drawing her quiet little worlds of trees and stars. I tried to rebuild structure too. I took a few half-days at work, sorted through paperwork, made appointments I'd been putting off. On the surface, it looked like life was moving forward. But inside, I still felt the fragility of it all, like the calm after a storm you know might come back. Then one Wednesday morning, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Sophie was at school. The sun had just cleared the ridge over our neighborhood. When I looked through the peephole, I felt my stomach drop. It was them. Richard and Diane stood on the porch like nothing had happened. My father adjusting his sleeves, my mother checking her reflection in the window. Neither of them looked ashamed. They looked composed. I opened the door just wide enough to block their view inside. "I wasn't expecting you," I said. "We thought we'd stop by," my mother said brightly, brushing past me like it was her house. "See how you and Sophie are doing." "She's at school," I said flatly. "Good," my father said, settling onto the living room sofa uninvited. "Then we can speak freely." That should have been my second warning. I didn't sit. I stayed standing, the coffee I'd just brewed cooling on the kitchen counter behind me. "We've had time to reflect." Diane began, her voice rehearsed. "And we realize emotions were high. We may have come across a little firm, demanding," I corrected. She blinked. "If that's how it felt, then we're sorry." But I could already feel it. This wasn't an apology. It was a redirection. Richard cleared his throat. "Look, let's not drag this out. We're here because your reaction was disproportionate. Family helps family. And frankly, you wouldn't even be in this position if Andrew hadn't. If Andrew hadn't died? I said, my voice suddenly sharp. Say it, Dad. That's what you mean, isn't it? A beat of silence. You misunderstood, he said, raising both palms. We're just saying you're financially secure now. We're not asking for everything, just a fair portion. 50% would still be theft, I interrupted. Diane looked offended. We raised you, Lauren. We gave you everything. Your education, your start in life. Now we're asking for some compassion in return. And you slam the door in our faces. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It wasn't joyful. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when rage has nowhere left to go. My husband died, I said quietly. And you showed up at my house twice, asking for what he left to protect our daughter. You didn't come to hold her when she cried. You didn't come when I couldn't breathe through my grief. You only came when you saw a check. Richard stood up. This is exactly what I mean. You're being emotional. No, I replied. I'm being clear. My mother crossed her arms. So that's it. We're just cut off. I shrugged. You walked out the door of our relationship long before Andrew ever died. You just don't like that I finally locked it behind you. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then my father said something that told me exactly who they were. Well, he said coldly, if you're unwilling to be reasonable, we may have to consider legal recourse. It's clear Andrew's estate was influenced by emotion. You were probably not thinking straight either. We'll speak to someone about contesting it. That's when I knew. It had never been about grief. Not for them. It was about what they could gain. Control, leverage, money packaged in the language of family. I walked to the front door and opened it. Get out, I said calmly. Lauren, my mother began. Now. They left, but not before my father muttered, You'll regret this. I didn't respond. After they drove away, I called Daniel Price, our estate attorney. I told him everything. I had a feeling this might happen, he said. But let me assure you, they have no legal standing. The will is sound. You and Sophie are protected. Still, I asked him to prepare a formal letter, something strong enough to send a message and clear enough to stop this before it turned into a lawsuit. Then I blocked their numbers. Not out of spite, but to protect peace. That night, Sophie asked quietly, Why did Grandma and Grandpa come today? I hesitated. They wanted to talk about some grown-up things. She looked down. Was it about the money again? My heart broke at how quickly she'd learned to connect their presence with greed. I nodded. But don't worry, we're safe. Daddy made sure of that. And so will I. She was quiet for a while, then said, I think Daddy would be proud of you. I pulled her close. I hope so, but deep down I already knew, because I was finally doing what Andrew had asked in that letter, what he'd trusted me to do all along, protect what matters, without apology. After sending Daniel's letter to my parents, things went quiet. No more voicemails, no more texts, no more family meetings disguised as ambushes. And for a while that silence felt like peace. But peace, when it follows betrayal, always carries an aftertaste of grief. Not for the people you've cut out, but for the illusion you finally stopped believing in. 2 weeks passed. Sophie settled into a new rhythm at school. Her teachers sent gentle updates, letting me know she was participating more, asking thoughtful questions again. But there were still moments, brief flickers, when I'd catch her staring at her drawing pad frozen mid-sketch, and I'd know she was missing him. She always would. We both would. One evening, after tucking her in, I found myself sitting alone in the kitchen sipping tea that had long since gone cold. I picked up my phone, half expecting to see another message from my parents. One more excuse, one more manipulation. Instead, I saw a new name on my screen. Barbara, my aunt, Uncle Martin's wife. We hadn't spoken much beyond holidays and polite exchanges. She'd been at the family confrontation, sitting stiffly in the corner, mostly silent. I hesitated, then answered. Lauren. She began softly. I want you to know I didn't know what that meeting was going to be. They told us it was about setting up a memorial scholarship for Andrew. That's the only reason Martin and I came. I didn't say anything. I wasn't ready to offer forgiveness, but I wasn't ready to hang up either. I can't undo what your parents said, she continued, but I need you to know not everyone in this family agrees with them. Some of us, we see what they've done, what they've always done. Her voice cracked slightly. And I'm sorry we didn't speak up sooner. That call didn't erase the past, but it chipped away at something heavier, the belief that I was completely alone. It reminded me that even in a fractured family, there are sometimes quiet allies sitting on the sidelines, waiting for a moment to do right. Over the next few weeks, others reached out too. Aunt Rita, who admitted she felt ashamed for sitting silently through my father's proposal. Uncle James, who had once seemed aligned with my father, mailed a handwritten note. Inside was a simple message: you did the right thing. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Even Madison, my sister, broke her silence with a single text. I didn't handle any of this well. I'm sorry. It wasn't a full apology, not yet. But it was the first time in years she'd acknowledged hurting me. And in a way, that quiet admission meant more than any dramatic performance could have. Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening inside our home. Sophie began drawing again, not just little birds or abstract shapes, but memory pieces. One day she handed me a sketch of Andrew holding a telescope over her shoulder. Remember when Daddy taught me constellations, she asked. I want to do that again. I nodded, swallowing the ache in my throat. We will, sweetheart. The next day I went into Andrew's office, the room I hadn't touched since the funeral, and opened the drawers one by one. I found the telescope still in its case, and a thick folder labeled in Andrew's handwriting, for Sophie, space notes. Inside were diagrams, beginner tips, and scribbled questions he had wanted to explore with her. My hands trembled as I flipped through them. He had been planning their nights under the stars before she was even old enough to pronounce Orion. That weekend I took Sophie out to an open field just outside of town. We set up the telescope under a blanket of Colorado sky, and I showed her how to align it using the North Star. She beamed, clutching her notebook. Daddy would love this. He still does, I said. Grief didn't disappear that night, but for the first time it shared space with joy. Real joy. The kind that isn't loud or performative, but soft and rooted. A few days later, I received a call from Ethan. I've accepted the position, he said. University of Colorado, starting this fall. I nearly dropped my coffee. You're moving here. He laughed. You thought I was going to leave you and Sophie to handle all this alone? And just like that, Andrew's promise that we would never be alone felt real again. Ethan's move didn't just bring logistical help. It brought something deeper, a living reminder of Andrew's humor, his values, his legacy. He didn't try to fill Andrew's shoes. He simply stood beside us, steady and present. One night after Sophie had gone to sleep, Ethan and I sat on the back porch watching the stars. She's doing okay, he said. She is, I replied. But not because things got easier. No, he agreed. Because you made the hard choices. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he added, You built a life that honors him, Lauren. Not just by surviving, but by protecting what he cared about most. I looked up at the stars and whispered, I hope he knows. I think he always did, Ethan said. And for the first time in months, I believed it. Grief reshapes everything, not just your routines or your relationships, but your definitions of family, of loyalty, of what it means to be safe. By the time Sophie's 9th birthday came around, nearly 4 months after Andrew's death, our life looked completely different, and yet in the quietest ways more honest. Our home wasn't filled with noise or celebration, but with steady love. Ethan had moved in temporarily. Diana and Robert Andrews' parents had just returned from a visit, having left Sophie with a batch of her favorite chocolate chip cookies and stories about her dad that even I hadn't heard. I thought we were finally past the storm. Until the envelope arrived. It was cream-colored, no return address, just my name written in my mother's familiar looping handwriting. Inside was a letter. But this one was different. No threats, no subtle guilt, no manipulation dressed as concern. It began plainly. Dear Lauren and Sophie, we've spent these past few weeks reflecting on how we handled everything after Andrew's death. There are no excuses. What we did was not just insensitive, it was cruel. We let our fear and self-interest blind us. And in doing so, we failed you. And we failed him. There were lines underlined in ink that looked smudged, maybe from real tears or maybe from the performance of them. I couldn't tell. But for the first time, they acknowledged their absence at the hospital, their selfishness during the funeral, their entitlement in the wake of Andrew's passing. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They didn't ask for money. They asked for time. We understand if you can't let us in, but we hope someday you might consider letting us earn back your trust. I read it 3 times before setting it down. Then I showed it to Ethan. He read it quietly, lips pressed in thought. Well, I asked. It's better than the last 50 attempts, he said honestly. But it's still words. The real test is what comes next. That test came 2 days later, in the form of a modest birthday gift wrapped in brown paper and a handwritten card addressed to Sophie. Inside the box was a book on astronomy. Not pink, not glitter-covered, not one of those generic girl gifts my mother always defaulted to. It was thoughtful. Sophie opened it surprised. They remembered I like stars, she said, running her fingers over the cover. And then, without prompting, she looked up at me. Can I see them? Just for a little while? If you come too. It was her choice, and I respected that. So I replied to the letter, setting strict boundaries. 15 minutes, in public. With me present the entire time. No discussion of money, Andrew's estate, or the past unless Sophie brings it up. We met at Sophie's favorite ice cream shop that weekend. They arrived 10 minutes early, dressed simply. No dramatic entrance, no tears. My mother brought a second copy of the astronomy book 1, annotated with sticky notes. Fun facts for Sophie and Daddy might have told you this. They didn't reach for hugs. They didn't pretend we were close again. They sat gently in her presence. They asked about school, about her telescope, about which constellation she liked best. And when the 15 minutes were up, they stood without protest. Thank you for this, my mother said quietly. My father added, we hope someday there can be more. I didn't answer right away. I just said, we'll see. Because reconciliation in our family would no longer be built on history or duty. It would be built brick by brick through presence, respect, and boundaries honored without question. Over the next few months, we allowed occasional visits, always on our terms, always with clear expectations. To their credit, they respected them. No more surprise visits, no more guilt trips, just quiet attempts to be present. Sophie was cautious, but curious. She asked questions. She watched them. And when they forgot a boundary, she reminded them gently but firmly. One afternoon, after another short visit, she turned to me in the car and asked, do you think Daddy would be okay with us seeing them again? I thought about it. About what Andrew would have wanted. About the values he lived by: kindness, accountability, but never at the expense of Sophie's emotional safety. I think I said slowly he'd be okay with it. If they showed us they've changed. And if we stayed strong about what's not okay. She nodded, satisfied. Because she understood something now that took me decades to learn. Forgiveness is not a door you reopen. It's a gate you build and guard with care. And anyone who wants in again has to knock with respect. A year after Andrew's death, Sophie and I sat on a wooden bench by the lake, his favorite spot in all of Colorado. The sky was overcast that day, but the water was still, peaceful, reflective. We had brought 2 things with us, a thermos of hot chocolate and the memory book Sophie had created in the months following the funeral. Inside were pages filled with stories, drawings, and ticket stubs from family outings. A piece of his shirt, one of his old concert wristbands, a Father's Day card she never got to give him. She opened to a page where she had written in her careful, rounded handwriting, "I still miss you, but I'm okay. Mommy's okay too. We're safe. You don't have to worry." I didn't cry when I read it. Not because I wasn't still grieving, but because it was true. And something about that truth made space for softness again. We sat in silence for a while, sipping cocoa, watching a pair of ducks move slowly across the glassy surface of the lake. Then Sophie said something that stayed with me. "I think the envelope helped them change." It took me a second to realize what she meant. The invoice she'd drawn months ago, her quiet act of truth in the face of betrayal. I looked over at her. "What makes you say that?" "They're different now. They listen more. They remember what books I like. They ask how I'm feeling, not just what I'm doing." I nodded, thinking of our last visit with her grandparents' brief, respectful quiet. No demands. No tension. Just a shared moment watching Sophie do a science project in the park. "They're trying," I said, "and sometimes people need to see who they really are before they can decide to be better." She picked up a small stone and skipped it across the water, just like Andrew had taught her. It bounced once, twice, then sank rippling outward in quiet circles. "Daddy always said being kind doesn't mean letting people hurt you," she said. "It means being strong enough to forgive, but smart enough to remember." I reached for her hand. He did say that. And he was right. Andrew's legacy wasn't just the insurance policy, or the careful files, or even the telescope tucked into our closet. It was this: the strength to protect what matters, the grace to hold space for healing, the courage to walk away from harm even when it looks like family. In the end, the life we rebuilt wasn't the one I imagined, but it was honest, and rooted, and real. It was the kind of life Andrew would have been proud of. As we walked away from the lake, Sophie slipped her hand into mine. "Do you think we'll always miss him?" she asked. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "But we'll also always carry him. In how we treat people, in what we say no to, and in how we love each other. Because grief doesn't end. But neither does love." Losing Andrew taught me the weight of real grief, but it was losing the illusion of family that changed me. Because sometimes the people you expect to protect you are the first to take advantage when you're at your most broken. And sometimes love doesn't come with a last name. It comes with quiet consistency, with presence, with people who choose you when they don't have to. In the end, Sophie and I didn't just survive, we rebuilt. And the family we hold on to now isn't defined by blood but by how they show up when it matters most. If you've ever had to draw a boundary that felt like losing everything you were taught to protect, if you've ever been called selfish just for choosing peace, just know you're not alone. And if this story touched something in you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs it too. Drop a comment below. I read everyone. And don't forget to subscribe so these stories can keep reaching the people who need them most.